Hello everyone, today we talk about the Betrayal. Um, this is a series of videos that I started doing from but this is the second that takes into consideration a bit more, you know, say conceptual rather than specifically theoretical approach to politics and war. Um, in a way that will serve to us at some point on Schwerpunkt that I realized for some reasons that I don't entirely know if they are appreciated. I must say you've been r- positively responsive to them up to this point, and that even surprised me, not because I doubted of your understanding in some ways, but because objectively, like it's not common at all in today's times to listen to such. Either you don't listen to the I don't know, I don't check the statistics anymore there, but evidently no, I get that there is an attention to these topics that may be interesting. And as you know, as I stated since a long time, actually Schwerpunkt is not meant, it's not designed to be uh, a political channel in the colored sense of the term, right? It's somewhat sad and actually problematic in our world to realize that the term politics, policy, and political, all the adjectives and the derivative terms are somewhat being intended in a never darker and fundamentally negative sense, right? That is, we are realizing after a time of relative prosperity, also absolute prosperity, looking at the past of mankind, especially in the West, to this moment of what appears of crisis, of contraction, even of open decline in certain cases, and posing a lot of questions about fundamentally ourselves. And this negative picture is a very worrying sign because it means in a way we've lost the initiative, right? Not that there's specifically a war going on relatively to the broader problem. I think we should accept this reality as for what it is and trying to work to find solution, positively speaking. But this is exactly what it seems to me that it is lacking, that there is an ever greater distrust, right? Why do we talk about betrayal today? Because historically speaking, naturally there is a lot to tell. Actually, we're faring in a very good time anyway, right? Even if lots of things are going dramatically wrong. Also, the pandemic that doesn't help, right? It is a gloomy, uh, there is a gloomy atmosphere, and it's understandable. It's understandable, humanly speaking, to feel that way. But we often forget we come from a past that was not even a very distant one, is being extremely worse at all levels, right? And here we can't make relativism about it. Of course, there are countries that arrived later into the process, so some can say, well, but I grew up in a disadvantaged context. I had it worse. Yeah, okay, yeah, I understand. That's why Schwerpunkt is mostly. I don't want it to be dedicated just to Westerners or to whoever is interested in Western side. It's obviously speaking from a Western perspective, and just posing out there a point that can be intended as a voice, like many others, and of course different ideas can work together sometimes. And there is therefore a serious moral problem because we have attached now to largely, as it's always been in the history of mankind, to politics specifically, a sort of fate or sort of blame. Generally speaking, we're saying that the old good morals are not there anymore. We have forgotten we are betrayed our roots, our beliefs, and all this dramatic talk. That I would like to stress, was believed historically, also basically in every other context. It's a way to look at the past and make it's even a positive process in the sense that this happens also in our lifetime. When you go through harsh times, we weren't particularly happy about the current situation and so on. We say, oh, this is a bad time. And eventually, after some here, we tend to remember just maybe pleasant things, and we are designed actually to forget the bad aspects of it. This is done, in my opinion, for the sake of a quite clear evolutionistic reason, that is to say, um, not being content about the present, that you're realizing that there is always an improvement that we need to make, and looking at the past in brighter terms is a way to make us understand that we're, inducting ourselves to believe that we're somewhat worsening, and to give us a boost to do better continues, right? And it turns out, it seems, we haven't done that bad overall over time, as was saying at the beginning. But there are certain periods in history which it's not just objectively the material condition, of course, that matters, and of course the ideal prevails in a way. And the reading of the past implies naturally the use of a narrative of any sort, right? And the way though we are looking at this past seems ever worse in a way. That is to say, wait a minute, right? There is something that has inverted the trend here. We are essentially criticizing the past for explaining that naturally the problems that we feel to have today, but in ways that are often, disturbed by the lack of knowledge of the same past, to say the least, which I don't want to make it a leitmotif of Schwerpunkt's rants, but is a great part of the problem. It's, in fact, we have, I presume, essentially as a political and social ensemble. Much of this malaise is often connected to the concept of betrayal, right? That is, someone back in the day did something tremendously bad. Not much with the betrayal, it's not just saying, we're talking about things like the Holocaust or other open, National Socialism had a kind of a uniqueness in it, in the sense, in the open claim that they simply wanted to exterminate all the inferior races, and that was quite clear for them, right? So they made extensive use of the concept of betrayal, as we've seen today themselves, or blaming and constructing their own ideology. But the betrayal, as we intended most of today, I would say it's often associated rather to, to the Machiavellism of policy, in a way, to the concept that someone had not been fair, had not been, honorable, had not been loyal, had somewhat done, something that for, I don't think even the romantic or chivalric standards would have, standpoint would have been considered, right, so wrong, in an hypocrisy that this judgment of the past entails in this regard, that is astonishing, right? And it's not a good moment to start from. In my opinion, it's actually the signal that, of course, yes, we are designed to improve ourselves, our own societies, but of course things over time can go better or worse at the same time. And it does seem to me, maybe I just fall in the same trap, that we are doing worse, right? At least at certain levels, and we are using also history in a very improper way to support certain ideas that I would say for the concept of betrayal are mostly connected to either internal political factionalism, that, I don't know, the Democrats or the Republicans, what the United States are concerned, but more universally, left and right, just make you understand what's the point. It's very easy to do that because mostly all communities have a left and a right? I don't know specifically of a country, historically speaking, that doesn't look at the current reality and takes certain directions. It's either it's overlapping on either what we think of a left or a right. Of course, the community in that sense can be dramatically, unbalanced compared to maybe our own, the standards of our own, but it's always essentially the same directions. That's why also, for example, I don't like very much the concept of, the idea that we have surpassed at this point left or right. I don't believe it is true, as I actually don't have a specific, politicized view of what left and right actually are. That is to say, it's not that I come from a context where, I don't know, I was grown in a family that believed in that specific party or ideology, right? And that now we have to fight against the end. I was not raised in that sense, and the reason for which I've actually grown suspicious from this background. Every statement was just trying to relativize the thing, right? It's either you were from that side or the other, or evidently, if you're trying to conceal that, it's bad, right? These are things can there are specific political strategies, I would say, that tend to do that, right? That are very sometimes not so subtle, to tell you the truth, because I don't think it's a particularly intelligent thing to say. It is you're ignoring their kind of a universal dichotomy, presuming that the other is so naive to believe that it's actually the case. And this subtle realization is also what is probably making us feel, from a certain perspective, more sensitive to the concept of betrayal, right? At least in neutral terms, but a bit more in positive terms in this regard, because it's actually, not much about betraying. It's simply realizing the person's being untrue. It's not speaking his or her own mind. This can be applied also to countries' policies, right? There are certain countries, specifically speaking, in the international arena, we could say, often say, we're not doing anything. We are reinventing that. They play with fake news, right? There is the idea of putting everything in relative terms, like, what politicians are all corrupted, every state does the same, it's always been like that, it's either you or me, right? This is plain relativism. And it's a card that is played, especially, in fact, like the countries that have this kind of policies are also the ones in which the population is more naive, usually, fearing wars, of being less educated in general. So it's typical dictatorships, actually. And, there is all the range also towards the democratic side. It involves authoritarian regimes up to, even certain democratic, corrupted realities and so on. And it applies to all of us at some levels. We are all trying to simulate or dissimulate something. And that's part of politics, though, right? It's exactly the weapon that I presume we are so disoriented by sometimes, exactly because we have believed naively in the simplicity, not of politics in the dichotomy you're telling me for, but in the genuinity of someone's motivations and reasons, right? We think that, after all, how do you want society to be so complex? We make a lot of videos about von Clausewitz that reasons axiomatically speaking. Von Clausewitz's theory is based on the concept, of course, that there is this absolute ideal that cannot be achieved by definition, but that reality fundamentally should be made, should naturally, first of all, modifies, and for which we should try instead to strive, because that is approximating to the truth, that we don't know what it is essentially, but we understand scientifically does exist. If you live in a world where you think that the truth does not exist, for example, that everything is to be put in relation, and believe me, there are way more people in this world that believe this than we often think, right? It's not that every country in the world historically is being taught to reason logically, rationally. So it's a very rare thing. It occurred only in this corner of the world. And in some ways, there are most people, I presume, out in there in the world do not even pose themselves the problem of trying to demonstrate something scientifically speaking. They just think, okay, I believe this and I should simply support the thing, which is also strategy, right? But it's not very clever, because when the other, comes up with the big guns that are mostly intellectual ones and manages to debunk your theories, as we'll see also today, certain accusations of betrayal, well, the thing is not really gonna work that much. And the same, just come back from Clausewitz, the same concept of the complexity of the world in this regard is beautiful, because it shows essentially the impossibility of calculating scientifically, sorting out scientifically the whole system altogether. Nobody does. Nobody knows, right? We would be omniscient if we could do something like that, and by definition we aren't, and that's why we're struggling in this world with the means at our disposal, including the scientific method that appears to be the best one, by proof, right? Not by wishful thinking, and that yet there is an order, there is a logic, there is something in here that works in a way that we have to sort out, but it does exist, and we can't find out more, right? This is a great concept. This is something that, since Kant, for example, wrote in this sense of thing about the knownness, what is properly cannot be known, but Kant believes that, of course, there's properly a limit of human knowledge, and objectively there is, because we're finite beings, so we will never know where we can understand, but we pretty much know that in practice, on average, we are somewhat doomed at many levels in this earthly experience. And I don't want to make it even darker than today's times, will make us already remind, but it is actually instead an empowering and positive concept. The idea that we can, after all, make things work, and I presume that the reasons why we can build skyscrapers, and the internet, make planes fly, it's all part of rationality in this regard, in this path that of mankind that made it at some point. And when you see other realities, we shouldn't. I don't think it's useful to judge, right? I don't think it's useful to make a chart, a list of civilizations, picking up to the one that is the best, because we need to feel that in some way that this is the case. But obviously there are certain objective differences that you cannot exclude, and that you can interestingly explain with the same rational method. That is, let's not be bowed by other thing we always come up with, things like that Sun Tzu is better than von Clausewitz, which is a deeper knowledge, because this ancient wisdom that just that reveals the naivety of an intellectual background, right? And let's applicate ourselves to study things like von Clausewitz, and always come up with von Clausewitz, not just because it's obviously the thing we often discuss, but this is not a von Clausewitz video anyway. But he always enters into this political and military dimension as if anything, as an explaining theory, right? But properly, let's realize that there is something that has already been observed and that works, and that we can use to fruitful results. The betrayal, in this sense, my opinion, belongs exactly to, as we've seen, this primitivity or naivety of thought. That is to say, you don't basically set a standard, a moral standard, whichever it is, at whichever height or level complexity of the system, and I pretend that if you infringe one of its rules, you're fundamentally a betrayer, an inferior, a criminal, whatever. I will not now digress in what broader moral problems, because I don't think I'm actually so versed in it, but I have my own ideas, and in the sense, you can't simply presume that things will go naturally better or worse all the time because you follow a moral standard, right? Moral standard, in my case, it's realizing that there is this sort of course, original sin, this restriction of possibilities that we always fail, we're doomed to fail, right? That we cannot make it alone. But that it is exactly as von Clausewitz tells us, for example, that we can sort out, as a science tells us, that we can sort out the whole thing, right? But still, there's a method that, of course, will bring to failure, as science shows all the time, right? Basically, we could even go as far as saying that the development of science and civilization happened thanks to failure, not to achievements, because without failures you wouldn't have any achievements. Or what would that be? You would live in the golden age. Everything would be at our disposal. We would be pure beings that just are, right? As philosophical conceptions of the first mover, the divinity. Well, welcome to the reality that we are not by the slightest, and that there is still, however, something that statistically works, right? Because it turns out it solves problems at a certain satisfactory level, and we can't improve that. And there is, however, still a human limit to this. And I think the current political and social reality, that is the one that also we analyze historically speaking, that includes violence and war, as we were saying previous times, is the greatest picture of this. After all, what do we spend our lives doing? Complaining about that the government is bad, right, and that doesn't get it right. And but would we be better in their place? I don't know, but chances are that we have this somewhat blind faith in what we should do, what we shouldn't do, but we don't even put the problem in perspective. That is to say, it gets down to mostly symbolical acts, right? That is, I don't know, if I am a vegetarian, for example, I should never buy meat, right? That can be a a short-term strategy, in the sense that what do you hope to do, that the meat industry will fundamentally sink at some point because of that. Everybody did that. Okay, well, good luck. But basically, you can say that every economical choice you make is killing animals, for example. And what are you doing about that, right? So there is, in that sense, I presume, with all respect that I have generally for animals. Personally, I eat meat, for example, but I do feel bad, right? And so I'm not an hypocrite that says, simply, I presume that I don't care because I want to show that I'm just, pro eating this, butchering this fucking beasts. No, I don't think so. I think it's bad, and I think that human reality is made of contradictions, and I think that things will change. I will adapt at some point, but at the moment it doesn't just seem like it. That's, for example, a first. Speaking of priorities, for example, is that such now the first problem in the world, right? For example, the instability of political and social systems isn't something massively more important than whether in a wholly consumeristic society that kills and destroys anyway, I buy supermarket an apple rather than a sausage. What's the point exactly here? You understand how ridiculous that is at some levels, if you think about it, because there is no moral. It becomes a moral crusade. It's a moralistic standpoint, but it becomes a way to solve the world's problems anymore. Because if you really care about world problems, you should look at broader things and what we do, in fact, politically and socially overall, right? And try to therefore reverting also to a universalistic ideal that doesn't entail, right, crystallization of moral standards, but fundamentally realizing that within this universe there are a lot of things that happen that are dramatically fascinating to study, to learn, and we can all benefit from this. Because dogmatism fundamentally it's the same thing. Dogmatism has always been there, right? It's never helped anyone, honestly. I don't think even, religiously speaking, the way we have of dogma is actually the correct one by religious standards, because, if you just obey to the dogma, you're just basically refusing the faculty that God has given you to make to make a difference, right, properly in terms of conscience and action. And so there are deep philosophical problems behind this thing, and I'm not trying to convince anyone about it, but just realizing that things are a little bit more complicated than what they seem, and that we should, first of all, starting from what nobody really wants to hear, also the dogmatic sense that whatever you do, you're doomed anyway, also by dogmatic standards. So that's actually a very positive way of seeing that, because given that you have this tragic idea of the world, you try to improve that. And once again, we go back to the evolutionistic thing, that's paradoxically what we should do. That is living in fear and pain, so that after all, we do something about it, and we increase our chances of survival, hopefully, in the process. You would say, what has this to do with betrayal? Well, it has to do, because it's a matter of moralistic standards with the fundamental problems of our world, and accusations of betrayal are often dogmatic. And in fact, what I wanted to say before, relatively to especially the either the politically factional or the national sometimes, for example, the behavior of countries during or individuals, whatever, but specific uh, agents, let's say, in the history of mankind, so that we remember the betrayer fundamentally. That guy is, after all, think about even there are subtle points about think about Jude and Pilatus in the Gospels that are actually a very interesting duo. Exactly, that shows, in my opinion, actually the great depth of thought of that religious context to explain essentially the subtlety of this. Right, from one side you have just a betrayer, right, in the canonical sense. From the other side you have actually a positive figure, right? An everyday not exactly, but a person that you would consider as a good man, right? Even for in that sense given that Pilatus was pagan in that sense by non-Judeo-Christian standards, um, and you see that actually what he does too, that is not taking action, for example, is condemned. And believe me, the Christian religion is very deep in many ways. Also Judaism is actually, and even Islam. If you look at the what stands behind, in fact, the mirror. There are many currents even in there are that Christianity stands out in a way of the legalistic background of the Jewish religion in a way that surpasses, in fact, exactly this simply moral that not even for Jews actually is just based. There is an enormous debate within Judaism between this. There are two specific currents, right? What is that you have in the Old Testament? It's very evident at many levels as well. That is what is that that matters, right? Actually, the fulfillment of the precepts of the law, or actually something else that derives from a more of an inner disposition. It's complex now. We can't descend into it, but it wakes us up. At least in the Christian case, that I think the duo wakes us up because it shows that reality cannot be simply framed within a simple set of rules. That it just doesn't take to betray someone to do evil, in a sense, right? You can't do it even just by not acting, or even worse, by pretending that you're doing something positive, and you're actually, killing an innocent, or in the literal sense of the word. And that's why we're saying before that you think you live in a society that doesn't cause harm, or that doesn't actually rationalize the sacrifice, the scapegoat, properly the victims of this world system. That is not the thing, that the West oppresses the rest of the world. Like, no, we're talking about all over, the system in itself, worldwide, whichever culture, whichever civilization, there is always someone who gets under, and that is forgotten, and that nobody cares about, and that will vanish without nobody remembering him or her. And there is the concept of justice naturally associated to it, but once again, this is not our point today. Since we talk about military history, the point we're making today is what is to say to categorize treason in a way. What does this mean historically or militarily, right? Why do, and also historically speaking, it's interesting because it entails naturally historical judgment within it. So as we were saying before, we remember certain people, groups, countries, etc., that just by hearsay or by tradition, they thought, those guys betrayed us at some point, wherever we are, whatever context. We'll have some idea of that. It's often reciprocal sometimes, but there are in this world, naturally, because of the ease of our communication, so and of the prevalence of certain cultures, at least that have a stronger voice, a higher voice than others, of certain interpretations that prevail over others, and that those are part of the victims we're talking about. Like, I presume that there are actually there's a lot of injustice going on relatively to the same history telling of many realities, and that's why we make history after all, because it's like an inquiry, right? Ways that makes an inquiry. The police does, right? For judiciary reasons, we must understand what happened exactly so that we can cope with that effectively. So history, too often, as we know, is turned like just in a story that may be even just instructive for a moral point of view, right? Fairy tales are designed for that as well, right? But history is actually something way more serious, because also determining whether a person more or a person less died after all. Yes, and even was one less, right? It's actually a very important thing, right? We're all happy if, one of person escaped from a genocide, but historically speaking, we must understand, for example, why we came up, for example, with a figure that was just approximating a certain way. This is actually a very serious problem, because I actually mostly see it from the underestimated side. That is to say, we often accept numbers, especially the larger ones, as if as Stalin did. A single death is a tragedy. Millions is a statistic. Something like that. It is sadly true, right? It is sadly true, and it seems to me, even in trying to remember certain aspects with certain tragedies, and where we often forget what the point is really about. That it's not about counting how many people a person killed in the sense that we can't find who is the better or the worse, but properly that we're talking about slaughtered people. And even if you accuse someone of having slaughtered, for example, someone that they didn't, but even if it was just one person, we're all happy that maybe it didn't happen to have to prove that. But the point is, wait a minute, this may be actually a serious matter, right? This happens in criminal cases all the time. How many people were sentenced to to death after some came up a proof, or after a lifetime spent in prison, it turned out that they were innocent actually. Unfortunately, these things happen. Of course, our judiciary says, I presume that they generally work, right? I don't have much, and historically speaking as well. So I just for the record, I'm not referring to genocide as saying, I don't know, we should revise, make revisionism about the greatest genocides of the 20th century just because, there could be a person less instead of one more, right? It's obvious that we all care for those things not having happened, except, a bunch of, extremists. But at the same time, you see what happens there, the victim is history itself. The victim is simply saying, okay, well, but we don't need to check, right? And this is kind of bad. If you went to trial and, just, the inquiry said, well, we think it's so, but we don't need to check more because, we don't care, right? Would you be happy? I don't think so. So this is also just for realizing exactly what happens. Also, this was for what history was concerned. Politically and militarily speaking, it gets even more interesting at some levels, because in there you have to take specifically a standpoint, because in there you have actually a real clash, right? It's not just, someone killed by negligence, for example. It's really about the fact that there are two parties that are trying to kill each other, and you have to determine there what was, if anything, we have some atrocities take, I don't know, National Socialism versus the Soviet Union, right? In there, I doubt there can be a person that, one can see that maybe obviously the positive aspect of National Socialism not having prevailed on the Eastern Front, because at that point it would have taken the world over. And fortunately for us, since the beginning, or better, unfortunately, because the war was fought anyway. That depends on the standards you count. The Germans had lost the war by 1941, and the thing went on with millions and millions, tens of millions killed more, right, in the process. But you can't objectively look at the Soviet Union and say, oh, well, since it was kind of less bad in terms of at least of openly declared ideology of wanting to exterminate a whole branch of mankind, or multiple ones for that matter, that that was actually positive, was a hero of the situation, right? There were actually two pretty ugly and bad regimes that were struggling for power in Central and Eastern Europe. That's all they were, right? There is no excuse, right? It wasn't like you can't condone National Socialism because it was fighting against Bolshevism. You can't condone Bolshevism because it was fighting against National Socialism. They were both pretty bad. There is just, however, the realization, generally speaking, that it was better that, after all, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets won, also in thanks also to the Western Allies' help, than the other way around. But if you ask to half of Europe, the eastern half of Europe that lived after World War II up to the 90s under the socialist control, well, you find objectively a lot of people that sometimes, even today's times, young people that say, okay, well, but now I will be like a right-wing extremist because I just hate those freaking, so embracing actually the other side's extremism just because you don't like the other. That's the naivety and the lack of moral education, objectively, and of moral relativism that disturbs me a lot, right? Because it seemed to be very widespread, right? It's not just something episodic. If you YouTube, considering that we are on YouTube now, if you look at it, if you look at any history, I don't know, go in every World War II video and look at what the comments are about, you will find a pretty hefty chunk of the users saying something extremely disturbing, condoning this totalitarianism or the other, just because they have, by the way, they are very personal ideas of what they were about in the first place, but also maybe just mixing with that nationalistic reason, identitaristic reason, or even racist reasons, for both sides, right? For example, nobody can hide that the Soviet Union was actually a Russian empire, right? It was just a prosecution of the Tsarist empire in many ways. Not quite in the same way, but there was naturally a Russian prevalence. It was a way of, adapting, thinking about the theory of communism within one country, of Stalin's view of communism compared to Trotsky's one, for example, of permanent revolution in the world, right? There are very important divides, and also something that was way more subtle than it seems. The more I study history, I must say, unfortunately, because this sounds as a very prejudiced opinion, but it seems to me that it's very difficult to, like, historical events can happen suddenly, even some great ones, like, I don't know, specifically now we're talking about the rise of National Socialism or of the Soviet Union and so on, that can happen banally for even just one thing, right? If the Germans hadn't sent Lenin into Russia back, with an armored train in 1917, we wouldn't have had the Soviet Union. Nobody would even know what it would have been, right? The saying goes, if Hitler had been killed by that British guy that was about to gun him down after it shot him in the trenches, we wouldn't even know what's National Socialism, right? So it's that easy, actually, to make certain things happen or not happening. But I presume that there is a substratum in civilizations that cannot really be erased so easily, even in matter of centuries and centuries. I wish it wasn't true, but it does seem to me that there is an aspect, or at least there is a broad chain of let's say of consequences, causes and consequences that relaunch certain phenomena. But this is also still a relative talk, right? Because it's difficult, of course, even to convince you even if I tell you that I'm, openly anti-Marxist, but definitely not a leftist, that, after all, it was kind of better that the Soviets prevailed on the Eastern Front. Because there is plenty of conservatives, as I presume I am, that instead believe, no, it was wrong. And implying what exactly? That, you would have wished, the National Socialism to rule in sovereign on the world, right? What's the alternative? Right? And let's be very honest about it, very concrete about this. Because if you're racist, okay, you're racist, you're disgusting, uh, but at least admit it, right? To make it this kind of passive aggressive, and by the way, cowardly way of never stating what you really think, because now the world blames you, and and still injecting the the supply this ideas. It's really even worse, right? It's frankly very disturbing, and you see it all the time. Yeah, I presume it's mostly young people, but unfortunately, at least from a just quantitative point of view, but unfortunately it is not, because it turns out that after all we didn't really change much from World War II. I presume so, right? It's not, unfortunately, not even the destruction of entire countries ever brought to the erasing of certain ideologies. And not talking specifically about National Socialism or communism, whatever, but I'm talking specifically about the hatred that pre-existed, even the one that was triggered by those events. That you can't really purify a country from this from stupid ideas or to dangerous bullshits, right? It's something that is always behind the corner wherever you go, right? And this applies to every single country. So even pretending that you're the good one, instead that you had, everything was fine from your point of view, it's also a good starting point, at least to start questioning seriously what also happened from your side. And I presume it's this kind of digging depth that at some point helps, because it shows you all the various levels and the complexity of the problem. I said that this video would be important essentially because we'll have to present at some point even the historical reality that is studied as such today, right? Of how the narrative of specific events that could even be the entire World War II that objectively is still impacting very, very strongly in that regard, because those kids on YouTube that commented the stupid stuff, they're fundamentally obsessed mostly about World War II. I don't know, because they played Call of Duty in their youth or whatever, but I can say it because I've never done it, but I played other FPSs also in World War II, so I don't want to be an hypocrite, but there's nothing bad in playing Call of Duty except it sucks, from a strictly military point of view, I can tell. But it's, it's a problem. We look at history mostly in masses, not in a very first of all, sometimes not even in a very different way from those times, but especially there have been also certain narratives that have been built specifically after, or even during, towards the end of World War II, for specific political aims that were quite concrete. I mean, they had to do with the Cold War, handling the the situation in Europe, in the world, and to distorting very much. And this is quite evident, for example, in the cinema, right? There are lots of, if you look at movies from the 1950s, 1960s about World War II, it's not just, you find sometimes even just the figure of the Nazi that becomes a tragic hero that wasn't, that bad after all, right? Even looking at specific realities that, certain characters that were properly stylized after specific Nazis that became almost think about the Battle of the Bulge, right? The guy played by Bernard Shaw becomes kind of a tragic hero in the movie at the end. They're just unlucky, but he's brave and whatever. But that was the design after a Nazi was just wanted to exterminate the entire Jewry, and fanatically loyal to Hitler and all to buying the wall pack, so the problem here is quite serious, because that's also why those prejudices and that popular idea of the thing has become. And there's a specific reason why even just Hollywood they wanted, for example, to restore to Germany the lost honor of the war, because there was a specific interest in those years, in those decades, right? But it has also popularized a reality, a face of the. Think about towards the late 80s also, just to be bipartisan. I don't know, I even loved that movie Dante, right? It's kind of idiotic, but I like Schwarzenegger's performance in that regard, because that's the time, in which, after all, the Soviet Union was declining, so it wasn't becoming just that problem anymore. So we could now stereotype the fanatic, the typically indoctrinated socialist police figure, into a positive hero. It was even challenging the American way of life and the system of values, right? Um, these are banal examples, but don't think that they do not impact us, right? That there is not like always this idea that after all, that thing was cool, right? Objectively, look at all these stupid documentaries they make. They even came up recently with a thing called Nazi Week, right? The weekly appointment, with history of national social on these things like Discord. I don't know what's specifically documentary, but they're watched by millions of people. And here, do you understand what it actually means? You make a documentary of National Socialism and you popularize it with a thing like Nazi Week, or excuse me, it was actually, I presume at this point even something pretty weird, that it was a whole week dedicated just to National Socialism. I'm perfectly fine. Show the thing, show the horrors of it, but do you have to call it something like Nazi Week and making just showing the various hierarchs on parade, stylishly dressed by boss uniforms, that it sounds like a gossip magazine, right? You would say I'm exaggerating. No, I'm really not, because the way of getting acquainted with this, also with this phraseology, with this way of framing it, it becomes you don't even study it for the historical thing in itself. Most of the youngest kids, youngest generations do not have. I presume there is a deep divide, even just by people born in the 90s like me, or others born in the 2000s. There is a deep divide in literally even just the memory of things like World War II. Right? It makes a big difference being born just after the Cold War. It was already something, for example, different for having been born within it. Even in there, the awareness, especially in the West, I could check at some levels, was extremely low. Right? I discovered that talking with even with my family and things, that they didn't even realize that there were things like plans of invasions, that there was all a balance in this regard worldwide. The naivety of people is disarming in a certain sense. We find it equally, by stereotyping either certain peoples as heroic, just for example, because they put up a resistance and it ended bad for them, as for example, military competent or military incompetent. There is usually also this extremely another thing that makes you realize that people do not study von Clausewitz at all, is that they look just at military results without looking, at the political one. Better, they look at military results without considering them as a consequence of a political reality. That is to say, why should we look at history of warfare in general? To count how many times, I don't know, France or England won a war against each other. That we are, dramatically getting at that, right? If there are people that reason like this, it's not just because it's their personal fault. It's like they come from a background that even if it didn't teach them anything concrete about these problems. Treason is part of this as well, right? And we like often to erase, if the guy was, from the good side, in theory, or just, succumb to the most evil guy becomes, just a good guy. Think about the Japan during World War II. I mean, the idea, for example, Japan was this terribly efficient, honorable, capable foe. That is a thing that was built fundamentally by the Americans, right? Because it's not that the Europeans had much to do with that in this, at least in the handling of Japan after World War II, as much as the United States did, despite of course the Commonwealth fought against you understand what I mean. But the Japanese were dramatically incompetent at many levels. They didn't have this serious military doctrine. They didn't have any, you know, there are myths that are created, right? And there are crimes that are forgot, right? There are narratives that are created in order to think about, I don't know, think about the fact that fascist Italy didn't quite have Nuremberg process like Germany did. And much of that had to do also with the problem of how to handle Italy after World War II. The large masses of Italian American voters in American policy, in American politics. There are not even Japan had a Nuremberg process like Germany, right? Nor it's disastrous. Like in Italy, for example, the Germans, for example, persecuted many of their. I mean, like many people were sentenced to death, as you know. 30,000 Germans were put in jail, but by the Western, as I think specifically the Western German government, or I don't know if it's the sum of Eastern German, but I don't know actually. But there were so many German war crimes, for example, in Italy, that eventually were not prosecuted because the same Italian fascists had gotten away with that since they had cooperated. In Italy, they basically erase everything, and there are still families that had their fathers, grandfathers killed, parents, grandparents killed. It still didn't have an answer, nor from Italy, not from Germany, not from the world complexively. This is a big problem. The same goes for basically every other European country, right? We're talking about the axis here to just realize that was something most evidently negative. There were Western Allies war crimes, but they were not systematic. They were also smaller things actually, and they were prosecuted. So that's a big difference, right? So you can't say that they didn't do anything bad. In the United States, there were still segregationism. There were still eugenetic laws in force. So it's not that it was such a deep moral standard, but by the 1940s, surely in relative terms it was, and you can't deny that. And we're all thankful to have been liberated in Western Europe by the Western Allies. So just to make a point, where do you find this kind of debate? Right, most of the debate gets down to things like, but they weren't all bad, right? Think about, the development thinking, of a person, and in front of all these problems complexively comes up, but they weren't all bad, man. Like it was just the SS that made, had war crimes. The other guys were normal. Yeah. Forgetting that National Socialism was rightfully elected, democratically elected in Germany, at least, aside from the violence behind, but, it was actually voted, and doesn't matter that the Wehrmacht also committed some of the greatest war crimes during World War. It doesn't matter, there are these narratives, this catchphrase, I don't even know how it works, it's hearsay, right, but people start to believe that, and that's a deep problem. Then you understand that behind that there is the idea that it's mostly still a form of racism because, maybe who says this doesn't like other, parts of the world or even parts of Europe. That there is all the idea that it's, if one belongs to one culture, it's either monolithically good or monolithically bad. And it's that easy to spot. It's so damn easy to spot, right? You always get that. That's the naivety of it. I mean, the fascinating aspect of it is they don't know that they are naive. They're trying to make you pass the thing as if they had a point, and they don't know because they don't know the thing. That's probably the gnoseological problem. Until you're ignorant and you don't hear there is malice as well, as you understand. But until objectively you don't know something, you can't act as if there was, because you don't even know that there is. And that's where historical education is actually a very important thing, because it doesn't pass through what you personally believe as an opinion. It passes through historical work. That it's something that can take a lifetime just to discover a very, considering the wall, very few things. But however, it's not that they weren't important for the people who lived in them. So a lot of things that do not work, but the concept of betrayal here is the wall within this, right? Every time there is a war, there is a political reality that wages it, that commands it, however. Then also the military that wages it, but they're the same thing as we know about in Clausewitzian terms. And therefore, there is always the point of, who did start this and for what exactly, right? And the use of force naturally entails that negotiation failed, right? And how it failed becomes very strongly a matter of deciding what also the moral standards, whose fault was that, hence the concept of betrayal in part. Today we take a few examples, right? So you understand that, militarily speaking, it's not even a matter of looking at the betrayal, because the thing is political, right? And it's even more complicated in a way. So let's speak of the traitor's role, for example. The traitor's role cannot be eliminated from any kind of negotiation context, right? It's very easy. Very easy. Think about any quarrel you had with anyone. Especially when you think afterwards about it. You try to build your own version of the story independently from, how morally objective you are about it. But you always feel that there's something that didn't work. Either within you or within the other person. It's actually always both, right? Because if you think about it, everybody could settle a matter at least in different terms. And it's not just better or worse terms. It also depends what you mean in that regard. But there's always someone that basically said, okay, I don't care. We'll go at war for this, right? It stops negotiating. So you automatically feel it's very emotionally relatable, this idea of, that guy was just an idiot because he betrayed, he didn't stay to the rules. Think about people that swear, use bad language. I presume that every mean doesn't quite, every aim not obviously doesn't justify its mean, but at least it motivates it in a way. And as a Clausewitzian, I think that, of course, it's very complicated and very difficult to reach a settlement, to do something. But there's always a way to settle it, also with violent means that are not necessarily going to be. Most of the times, they're probably worse, right? They can't. It's not that violence is something particularly advisable, let's say, but at least it's the quickest way of solving the matter. And that's why exactly you may just think in terms of time or resources. That person doesn't have time to waste. He just sends you to hell, and that's it, right? So you feel morally, uplifted by this. They say, oh, the guy, used a bad wording against me, so I, I am the morally, maybe you're just the idiot who, I don't know, double parked and didn't let me out, or in that case, it's difficult also to, to solve the problem just by sending to hell. You have to get the hell out of there. But there are other situations in which I personally found myself also in the not of using violence, because fortunately I never had to beat someone, at least in the serious sense. In school things happen in that sense, but when you're a kid, who doesn't? But it never harmed anyone with the actual intention to cause serious injuries or anything. Nothing serious, nothing. Never been in a brawl. Just to make you understand what I mean. But there are violent ways to react that can help, right? Especially in front of people that you morally judge as idiots, right? For example, I'm a very impulsive person, and when I judge, when I see that a person to me is an idiot by standard, I'm very arrogant, right? And sometimes I sound kind of nice, and so but because I have to be entertaining in a way, but I'm not really. I'm kind of sometimes even rude and mostly arrogant. I can't stand certain attitudes. I can't stand people who don't speak, straight. They try that are slippery or creepy. I don't like that. If anything, you understand, I'm kind of direct. And in this straightforwardness, it also happens to me to react violently, into situations. That is to say, I deliberately choose to do it because I don't see how, for example, being always polite can be always a solution, right? There wouldn't be wars if it was the case, and wars are not just fought because someone got triggered and emotional. Wars are enormously complicated political and social processes, and mostly pass through the rationalizing aspect of policy that decides it. So it's literally the least of all fields of let's say of conflict, which there are which violence is used for no reason. So you can expect also from interpersonal relations how easy it is to be violent. So there is always a point when an agreement is worn down in such a way as to allow one of the contractors to declare its rupture. Right? It's quite evident. So this traumatic process is never without signs. This is also very important. If you think in the phase of negotiation, the cracks that announce it often begin well in advance, right? And betrayal is nothing more than the inevitable conclusion of a process. And when things are done, the traitor will list the long series of wrongs suffered and the repeated violations of the agreements that have inevitably pushed him to a definitive pronouncement, while the betrayed, in this sense, will underline how the best proof of the traitor's bad faith in the conduct of the relationship is the betrayal itself. Right. So it's in a way a conversation between deaf people. Right. It doesn't quite get to the point because the both of them have already decided their own way that the situation had to, at least one side had decided it had to arrive to that point. Right? And there is even in here a dichotomy of aggressiveness and defensiveness. It's obvious that the person that has the strongest motive usually is the one that has no reason to go on with the negotiation. Right? So it's mostly he will probably strike first most of the cases that will seem like the betrayer, right? And this is also very difficult to frame in perspective because the context may be dramatically complicated. It may not just be two sides, right? What it's out there is all to really realize in the process. So as we were saying before, the reconstruction of the steps that led to this outcome will be largely influenced by value judgments, right? From which it is very difficult to extricate oneself, in which instead, I really want to avoid openly renouncing any analysis from the ethical point of view, because someone is damaged by betrayal and someone he wishes and urges is instead benefiting from it, and the simplest observation would monopolize my examination. So it's already settled when it happens. This means that what we look at in the history as betrayals, or as alleged betrayals, is fundamentally, first of all, picking side in a narrative, in a way, right? That is based on, the guy attacked me first without any forewarning, but what was really the context of that? That is not to say, the guy simply wanted to knock you out, just found the best option and did it, right? When we're talking about international policy, we're talking about relations that mostly have worn dramatically out, right? It's not that you attack a country that's done really nothing against you without any reason, or without trying to, to really deal with the situation in maybe in other ways first, that may have actually worsened the same relation. So one would have to look at it in ways that are not banally, as, the guy attacked me first and I didn't do anything first. That's quite naive way of considering a betrayal, right? Because it doesn't consider whichever the broader relations within this reality can have been before that very moment, excludes them. And it kills history in this regard, because it says, it doesn't matter that, that these countries had come, to grips with each other. They didn't like each other. They were distant. They had conflictual interests in common, and they perfectly knew that since a long time before. No, it all gets down to the point. The guy attacked me first, so formally, I can make you buy that was a betrayal. What is a betrayal, right? There are, now we're talking a lot about the 20th century because of the aforementioned reason. Think even about, that I like the Romans and Roman history a lot. But think about the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, and don't think that there are in this regard many, a few, connections actually with even modern nationalistic issues and broadly meant, because the matter of Romans and Germans is not what you could say, between, ideally Italy and Germany in nationalistic terms today. It's really about, a broader Weltanschauung of the, what do you think about tribalism? What do you think about the universal empire? What do you think about, there are models, right, of interpreting the world. Well, you would think, of course, from a Roman perspective, that Herman, that Arminius was a betrayer, right? Because objectively, he got the Romans there, made them believe to the last he was with them, so the action was. But the point is, if you look at it from the German side, the question is, what would have you done? Like, what is more important to you? Is betraying a people that has invaded you, something so bad for the formality of having, tricked them into that ambush, or, more important than your country being free, right? Of course, Arminius was a bastard in general because he wanted to impose his power all over the other Germans, so that's also why he was knocked out, as much as, that this is kind of very well known history. But, I presume many Germans that participated, mostly the Northwestern at that point, but, that participated to that were quite happy that, in spite they, of course, were distrustful towards Arminius himself, as, the Germans were usually among each other, as they loathed any kind of super, the overpower coming to rule over them. They were quite happy and absolutely didn't care about the fact, even if they cared so much, for example, in terms, ideally, in the ideal of loyal, face-to-face combat, all this stuff, actually, they mostly fought naturally in the cunning way, also with ambushes and all this stuff, because it was functional to the thing. And how can you, and the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, many people say, it's exaggerated because they want to debunk them. I actually believe it was actually a very important thing, also just from a military point of view, and it was astonishing. And it's, reasoning in Clausewitzian terms, the history of an incredible political success. That is to say, how the hell can you unify enough Germanic tribes in the 1st century AD? Right, in a situation that is dramatic, there is no overpower. They're all scattered. They all do whatever the heck they like. Right. So, of course, the gluing factor in there was the Roman occupation, but overall, it was a masterpiece. Right. The Germans lost also freaking lot of men. Right. Possibly even as much as the Romans. Right. There is to say here that, of course, the history there it's also mediated from a certain senatorial aristocracy that wanted to show that Germany basically sucked, that they didn't have to go there, that they didn't want to invest in Germany because it was a waste of money. So the empire actually tried to reinvade Germany a couple of other times after the conquest of the 1st century AD. But there is also a bit, you read 1st century historiography, you read surely not pure truth at so many levels. So as far as we are concerned, like at that point, okay, it was a betrayal, but then what, right? How is that you actually fight, right? So let's analyze it from just a military point of view. Let's leave the political side of the story that is distracting Yeah, at some levels, because everybody freaks out because now I've touched the thing of the Tudor force that everybody has an opinion. But just take it from a military point of view. So, if according to you disloyal means are bad, so according to you from a military point of view, the concept of ambush or just of military asymmetry shouldn't exist, right? War is asymmetrical by definition. There is no such thing like symmetrical war. There's never been. And that's exactly what you're searching for in war by definition. That is to put the enemy in a condition in which you can harm him more effectively at all times. So what's the point of this all? Right? That whoever actually attacks you is a bastard, and instead when you attack him, that's kind of fine. Because these are the moral standards of betrayal, right? And unfortunately, I think especially in Europe, there are still this ideas that somebody at some point betrayed someone, right? There are many examples of this. There is the idea of, for example, of Italy during World War I. There is, I don't know, the Habsburgs against the Hungarians at all times. Basically, that's what, at least from an Hungarian perspective, will tell you, and vice versa at some point as well. Because technically, if you look at the history of Austria-Hungary, but this is something that can't go back to the time of the 16th century, even before, even the time of the Mongol invasion. There is. There are actually lots of examples all over every nationality. I'm not keen on all of them, but because I frankly find them pretty stupid in general. But there is this idea that at some point a country betrayed another, and that becomes a matter of an entire, sometimes national judgment. That is to say, those are those are traitors, right? And once again, it's not a sign of great awareness, of great historical, political, civil awareness for people to reason in these terms, right? It's not it's not deep, it's not insightful, it's not it doesn't see at the thing in any form of perspective, and this has nothing to do with relativism. It has to do with the guys who wanted to achieve something. And why shouldn't they have achieved that, right? Do you think that any country stopped at some point from expanding because they had, some care for the other people, that didn't intertwine with their own benefits? Like I don't want to spread distrust among countries. We should unite all to a common good, in my opinion, and we do. But most of the reason here, we are at the roots of social contracting. We do it because we expect a benefit from it, right? It's not because we presume that at any time this benefit cannot come but from attacking someone, right? If it's necessary. So it is actually an important thing. And so the whole diplomatic game, alliances, non-alliances, negotiation, it's a whole load of nonsense when there is a specific reason, a specific motivation, and the guy just wants to do that, right? So you say, but so you're condoning every kind of betrayal in this way. I'm not condoning it. That's the point that we have with the problem that we have with this phraseology. When you study history, you are not worried about finding the good and the evil guy. You should be concerned exclusively with understanding what the hell happened, for which reasons. What is that brought to that? And believe me, it's something extremely difficult, because there is nothing more complicated than starting studying the history of a war. Even just if you have to study it from a military point of view, and in finding a starting point, it's extremely difficult. Not even with single battles you can't properly do that, right? That is, the sheer complexity of an act of war. And what motivated it. If you don't understand the motivation, you can't understand the act of war in itself, what they were doing it for. So that entails an enormous set of knowledge, of awareness about and disconcertingly wide setting of of elements, like figure about the politics, the society, the culture, that country, the relations, the various communities, the institutional system. I mean, it's something extremely complex, and that's why also modern, if you take strategical analysis, um, fundamentally you realize that even just experts in the field cannot go very much beyond it, especially to try to sort out what will happen next in the world, cannot go very far, because especially things go on, and the useful time is usually 4 months, and those pass easily, and you don't start studying anything in 4 months seriously. But the point is, even after when these things actually happened, finding the reasons why it happened, it's enormously complicated. I mean, the whole historiographical debate is fundamentally about this. It's about the fact that someone wrote something at some point, and we have to try to understand whether it was like real, like if it is supported by evidence, if there is another way of seeing that, if maybe we weren't wrong. What do you think history is? That is the story, the tale of that guy who attacked that other guy on that date, and that's how many people died. That's not it, right? That goes well for a football match, right? With that could be even way more complicated than that, but in inside. But so you can imagine what a war, a world war, but not even, just even a small one. Make some exercise on some small war, and try to understand the complexity of it. You will never end. So is betrayal, which is an extremely subjective thing to even point out, like an object of learning or study? Of course, history does, right? And exactly because it does it turns out that these popular misconceptions are often explained in way more complex terms. That is to say, that have nothing to do with putting the thing in relativistically, but simply to realize that sometimes it's just because one of those subjective narratives prevailed, maybe in a certain historiographical context, for political reasons or ideological reasons, and then other countries copied from that, and maybe didn't hear the other guy's voice. It turns out sometimes it was the other way around. Believe me, it does happen a lot, right? And nobody cares, because if your point is that the guy is a betrayer, and that is convenient to you, so that you can, feel good about it for whatever reason, you're not willing to hear that. You don't even care. That goes together with many political ideologies. It unfortunately happens all the time. So let's look at some historical example. There are plenty of. We talk a lot about the Middle Ages. So, for example, we can talk about Dante Alighieri, who, for example, had no difficulty in condemning Judas, Brutus, and Cassius to the perpetual chewing in Satan's jaws, right? Because they were traitors of authority, both religious and imperial, which appeared to the Tuscan poet as indisputable, right? And the worst penalty for the worst crime. So Dante touches very interesting topic. We never talk about Dante much, and I think we never dedicated a video, which is astonishing, given that we are fundamentally medieval based on Schwerpunkt. But his work objectively is very difficult to address because it was enormous. Even in his case, you wouldn't realize why he has this judgment if you don't understand the fact that Dante primarily was not a poet, but he was a politician, a knight. He had his, economical activities, properties to manage. He was a diplomat, right? This man fought in first line in open field in 1289 in a pitched battle. He went on warring in Tuscan hills with the Ghibelline and white, as it was, wealth exiles of Florence. He had an extremely atrocious life in this sense. That was the life of of lots of people of his rank at the time. This fundamentally lesser nobility, but still, quite important. Um, so Dante is also an anachronist writer, right? Many people look at him and say, look at this guy. This is what essentially medieval people believed at the time, by the essentially the beginning of the 14th century, when he wrote the Commedia, from which did this condemnation of Judas, Brutus, and Cassius in the Joseph Saturn stone from allegorically. Actually, Dante was anachronistic. He was some 2 or 3 generations late of this universalistic ideas, and he does it for all a series of reasons that are both literary, have a lot to do with the guy himself. He's a bit of a mystery because he was a very chameleon-like mind in some. He could write about everything in the most different terms, in terms of form, style, form, and form expression. So he's not easily frameable. But it's obvious that he was actually. Many people say, "Oh, Dante was actually Guelph." That is a pro-papal. The white Guelphs, by definition, we could say, were actually Ghibellines, right? People say, "Well, not really, because they had a different vision." No, they were Ghibellines. Believe me, because I studied this thing from the spring, from the source. In fact, if you just read the Commedia and you don't look at the political and military context, you don't get much of how the statement is true. For example, it's pretty clear. He simply lived in exile at the court of the imperial vicar in Italy for the Holy Roman Emperor. So there is something about that really makes you understand why the betrayer of Judas, of course, Dacid, we could call him. Brutus and Cassius obviously refer to the plot that killed Caesar, that was seen in this. In the perspective and narrated from the Augustan propaganda in the Middle Ages, of course, that Caesar was in a sense the founder, not necessarily founder of an empire as such, but medieval historiography now, it was very its goals were others in an ideological sense, but of course Caesar, and that's also how all the Roman emperors were called. So he embodied the supreme authority, right? Of religious imperial. Dante lived in the same time, which of course so many people wrote. He was waiting for the arrival of Henry VII of Luxembourg in Italy to bring order against the Guelph Angevin bloc that had formed there, and of course all the poets, all the people, the writers called Henry Caesar because that was his name, right? So you enter in this perspective. So what does happen? What is Dante thinking about here? Of course, he is thinking about the Guelphs. Of course, he's thinking about Boniface VIII, back in that he sentences to death, and all the people today believe that Boniface VIII was a monster because of Dante's propaganda and the Philip IV of France and the Colonnades liberalistic about this. They don't even know who Boniface VIII actually was as a person, and the fact that medieval political propaganda, extremely effective, extremely sophisticated, Boniface used in the same exact way, naturally wrote things like, that people were perverts, they were bad, and people, today in 2020 believe that what is stated in a 14th century political propaganda source is factual reality, because, context is useless, right? Who cares about history, practically? But that just for saying the naivety of the thing. And Dante was not naive at all, and that's exactly why he wrote this, right? These people who had betrayed the religious imperial authority were known as but King Robert of Naples, who was a Capetian, who was descending from the French royal dynasty, and the papacy, the impure papacy that opposed to the empire that sent, the French in against the rightful Swabians that controlled southern Italy. That's the background. And if you had seen the reality he lived in, Guelphism and Ghibellinism was of course just sometimes also a matter of convenience. Actually, the Ghibellines believed much more in the coast than the Guelphs, because the Guelphs practically as such did not exist. I mean, they could be allied with the Angevins, with the papacy, but they essentially wanted to remain low. And even the Black Guelphs, that were the allegedly the most papal feels, I don't know how to say it, philopapals, excuse me, were sometimes in fighting against the Pope. It happened, actually, and especially with the context we're talking here about. So, but of course he was writing here the Commedia that had to picture the universalistic standards of what the old, in fact, perfection, this whole perfect structure of the creation had to be. And of course he couldn't say, okay, well, but betrayal doesn't really count, you see, because there are all these other reasons involved, money, stabilization. After all, the Angevins weren't also just all that bad, not even the other Guelphs, because it was technically also Guelph, so you think how it's messed up. That's it. That's why you see the betrayal of it. Of course, the religious thing is deeper, because of course Judas is the betrayer per excellence in Christian, that's obvious. But he would have never written this thing with this cruelty, with this horrid condemnation. If he hadn't been thinking to the reality he was grown in. Right, and this is just an example. And Dante was a man of the 14th century that where universalism was breaking, but was still theoretically there. That is, nobody dreamt of a world without papacy or empire, still, in spite of their decline. We moderns are instead much less inflexible in this regard, and show, Dante was committed, for example, to a reality that for which he was forced, he was exiled, right? So he was forced to take that side, in a way. He might have been more flexible in a way, but the iron logic that existed in those times policy is something that we are very far from. That's why we're becoming naive to read history and avoiding looking at it as in terms of things like betrayal or not. In fact, Dante himself was being not naive but idealistic in that sense. And he was perfectly aware of it, in a way. It's not that he was a crazy guy who thought that now just every Guelph had to die because they were just a bunch of bastards. Of course, he had, he was a normal person. He lived in a world where there were so many different affiliations, right? He lived in a fundamentally Guelph city, so that was before he was exiled. So that's the importance as well as in terms of flexibility. But our own flexibility, in this sense, derives from actually a setting of positive things, but also which is such as, for example, considering a wider range of points of view, which we are objectively educated to do. Also from naivety, also from the fact that, okay, but after all, who cares? Think about how the moral standards have relaxed in the last generations, just, for example, from a religious point of view, right? From just in terms of manners and in behavior, in kind of morality, it's I don't think all in all it's this greatly positive thing. Aside, not making it because of religion and in general, I think people back in the day were kind of dumber, but they were tougher. Like, if they were committed to one thing, it's because, in partly, of course, that they were obliged, but society imbued them with this sense of duty, right? Something we have forgotten, for example, when we look at the history of the 19th century, or the 20th century even, actually, is, for example, how much from the 19th century we had inherited the concept of duty, right? When you study 19th century warfare, never always think all the time that here these people were doing it because it was their duty. Something, for example, by the 18th century, of course, duty always existed in a way, but it wasn't like that, for example, in the 18th, right? It was something much more binding there, that nation state had created that in part and consequently also nationalism. So you can't even understand the Great Slaughter, World War the First, if you don't accept that actually at the time people were a bunch of nationalists, racists, by default, right? And it was normal by the time. So certain beliefs, certain ideas were commensurate in a way to that world. That is not to condone them once again, but we're not talking naively of a world that was dragged into warfare just because these pure innocent people hadn't any thing to believe about war. They were all most of the people were actually especially in some countries were war enthusiasts, right? It was the prevalence of these ideas, and surprise surprise, many of these ideas were soaked into the concept of betrayal. Those damn Germans that attacked us in 1870. The French would have thought, right? Those damn French that we defeated but still want to recover the lost territory. The Germans thought, right? It was all like that, right? And they I don't know. You find it in many other situations. It's not that the Germans and the Russians liked each other particularly, as we've seen. The Austro-Hungarians and the Italians didn't like each other particularly. There were all these also sometimes openly racist, sometimes proto-racial, sometimes just negative anthropological visions that began to fuel. But nation-state had a great responsibility to this, right? Actually, some of these countries were still much more multinational in a positive sense that we imagined, but unfortunately for them, also part of the cause of the war was due to the harshening of this reality. Think about the problems between the Austrians and the Hungarians after 1867 within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a serious problem, and all the enormous hatred between, for example, the Slavs and the Hungarians within the same Austro-Hungarian Empire. This sense of fierce competition and prevalence, that didn't betray, in fact, openly imperialistic, nationalistic ideas. And also look at what happened after World War the First. Living in Central and Eastern Europe at the time would have been not very nice, just telling you. Aside certain exceptions, for example, Czechoslovakia had, before World War II, a pretty positive, democratic, sound development. Other countries had it kind of worse. Entire countries were redrawn on the map, entire populations deported. They were generally ethnocized, all this stuff, the worst you can imagine. And they were all fueled by the concept of betrayal. Now, those are our ancestors 100 years ago. What are 100 years? Right? Objectively, how do you think it takes to say 100 years ago, oh, it seems so much? No, it doesn't seem so much, actually, if you think about it. If you're already in your 30s or late 20s, you can't sense that it's not a long time ago, after all. Right? If you're older, especially, you can't even arrive to know what it was like in these dramatic contexts during World War II and so on. So it's there, right? But in fact, there is an aspect about modern times compared to those ones. You see, those ones were still believed in a collective sense. Right, these were, as we were seeing, nationalists, racists. They actually there was fierce social divides. People, were content. But for example, these people were capable of saying, "Okay, I'll go to war, not just to kill other people, but if necessary to die, to be killed myself." Right, it was a much more, communal value, after all, collective. Feeling about what your state, for example, was about. It had to be. Today, you would think that in a universalistic sense we're going towards that direction, but it doesn't seem to me. On the contrary, it seems to me that we are not familiar with any universalistic ideal, with things like supreme authorities. Just imagine if we had to live in Dante's time. What is the papacy of the empire? How do you explain to a kid born in the 10s of the 2000s what is the papacy in the empire in the 13th century? It's not easy at all, right? What kind of perception they have about this? Instead, it seems to me, rather than dealing with supreme authorities that evidently do not exist in this world, even less so, for example, than 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we are experiencing at this moment a narrowing of our social horizon. Right? It's a sort of withdrawal into ourselves, our interests, our conveniences, in a way. Like it's the same society, aside from the political, say, superstructures that bring us to live fundamentally like that. Right? We strive for it because there is objectively some value in also being free to do whatever you like, but also be aware that this brings to an individualization that may not be very useful for a insightful view of what should happen from a civil political point of view, broadly meant. Right? There are lots of these attitudes, even just in international policy, right? Since we screwed up, in the last wars. Now we shouldn't attack any other country in the world because that's simply wrong. We should never do it. Yeah, okay. So if you had been in the 1940s, you would have been an isolationist. You'd have let millions of people to be deported and exterminated, Europe-wide, just because I didn't want to deal. There were people like that at the time. It was hard even just for the United States to start opening in perspective since the World War I, in which after which the Americans were basically disarmed, right? They had also to build this capabilities to intervene in Europe, so it was a completely different reality. So we discussed actually this point, but the return of isolationism. It's actually a pretty stupid idea, to put it mildly, right? So whatever happens, you will not go out there, because what's your plan in the situation? That this is not just a political point, right? That is to say, you will never intervene in anybody's affairs because you think that boots on the ground are something different from economical policies or other forms of penetration in the country in other ways. You can't trace a difference, right? That's the way we're also driving away from. We are being scared by using violence to the point that, no, war is bad, should never be used. So say, okay, yeah, what about the resistance? So we should never fight against any tyranny, or the criterion should be that if you are from outside the country, you shouldn't care, right? I understand that people are becoming ever more ignorant about other countries, because this is also the reality. People dramatically even if it's a stereotype, but at least they had some curiosity towards other nationalities. Today, people can go everywhere in a few hours in the world, but nobody seems to even care to know what's the reality outside. What is the history of a country? What's the culture of a country? What's the policy of a country? Right? No, it's just about traveling, taking a bunch of selfies in front of monuments. You don't even understand what they mean, and go back home so that you can share with your friends and think you're cool and you have achieved something. This is what international policy relations, mass-wide, are becoming, it seems to me. And making dramatically a lot of relativism about what the country is for that matter. It's also, in terms of civil rights or, crime, corruption, whatever. Also, I don't remember the point it was making, which was actually was a good rant, about isolationism. And secondly, just from a strategical point of view, what's your plan, right? That you think that in 2020, if you're a state, like if you want to defend your, because many people say, okay, let's do like Switzerland that cannot be invaded. Well, technically Switzerland can be invaded. Actually, you don't even need to invade. You can nuke it to some level, but it's not the point. The point is always there in Clausewitz in terms of how much it costs. And anyhow, getting on the defensive, thinking that in 2020, where everything is fluidifying in so many levels politically worldwide. All communications are already extending. There are so many links that are, the frontiers are now so easily permeable that you can defend yourself by using the criteria and not stepping on physically on somebody's soil, boots on the ground. Is that your criterion that we think you will prevent you from being invaded, or do you think that your country in 2020 can be military self-sufficient without all the componentistics and materials and chemicals that are needed to make that your armored forces work, your military work? Do you understand how regressively primitive this mentality is? Right. Sometimes I'm a bit posh, and I want to think that it's because now the masses have been freed. They can write all this stuff on the internet. So now we just hear their voices for the first time in history, and it was quite non-surprisingly non-necessary voice at some level. Or I'm too harsh. Of course, it's important, but I presume most of these ideas emerge from people that have never wrapped their mind around certain things. Right. Because if you have lived in the world just throughout the 20th century, what kind of idea competence you may have gained about these facts if you pretend that the response towards problems is isolationism, right? Every ism, as we've seen, is dramatically dangerous at so many levels. So I know I'm going harshly today on these topics, but I presume they are important to be told. And especially in these terms, right? The problem, you see what the problem also is, though, is that national interests, meant as purely national, that is to say you're a citizen of a country, so you should care about this country in a way or another, together with other things, but that's the point. National interests do not seem so any longer identifiable. That's why I think, for example, nationalism is stupid, not just because it's objectively a very primitive idea, just from us, in terms of political philosophy, political theory, and just as a proof of, historically speaking, but exactly because it doesn't, it completely mismatches the reality we currently live every day in. What's your point, right? One thing is being there's a difference, for example, between nationalist and communitarian, right? You can be communitarian in the sense that you want to preserve some aspects of your culture, whatever. The opposite is multicultural. Even in there is something between that always happens, because no value, no people, no country, no culture has ever been the same from a day to another, and thankfully it will never will. And this has nothing to do with marrying to multiculturalism that wants to force mandatorily, as many cultures, stuck together, right? And that's also not how it works, historically speaking. Really, to make it work profitably. So it seems sometimes that national interests has become a burden, right? Look at let's not be specific about certain countries' policies today, but the fact that everything that someone does seems to be criticized, not because it's the guy, right? Okay, we're talking about Trump, right? It's not that Trump is a difficult topic to debate, actually, because there are certain aspects that require attention that are, for example, never discussed. Things, for example, how he managed, financially speaking, the world aid. But at that point, if you realize that there are entire sections of such an important, place like the United States, of its population, that are getting ideologized in a hysterical sense, to say this is happening in Europe at the same time, anyway, are hysterical. So at the point, ideologized at the point that everything just a person does is wrong anyway. You understand? Where's the national interest in all this? Right? It could be bad, it could be good, it could be bad. Of course, we know that political relativism, it's that bad. We see it from every side, mostly from the media. It's disgusting. I presume actually the average American is a way more balanced individual, because otherwise simply the country would explode otherwise. And in fact, there is sound evidence of this too, also in the last, in the events of the last months. Um, but the point is, what's in these ideologies connected to the Clausewitzian idea that war is the direct persecution of policy by other means, right? What can you do specifically about this in terms of competence, of understanding of how you should use that mean? It's kind of interesting because see that's also regressive. Because, for example, the use of violence, we discussed the other time about terrorism, all this stuff. You see that, the popular reactions to violence are typical of the masses, that are very irrational, right? And that's basically useless. That's also why it's not just fault of the masses, but also the one of the leaders that shouldn't inflate their moods in some way. So that's also why Trump's topic is controversial, because whichever side of the story you wanna see it from, there are certain, it's not so limpidly univocal as an interpretation. Also because objectively, historically, there are some things we still don't know. But once again, the masses presume they know, right? Hell, they do. They believe that it's also evident. It's really not most of the time, and it's very difficult to even have enough knowledge, especially through the more widespread means of information. So betrayal, to come back a bit more on the conceptual side of the story, is the natural consequence of the identification of a discontinuity in the common recognition of shared interests. As we were saying before, we realize fundamentally that we could work all together, but at some point you did something wrong, because it's hard to accept to be wrong yourself. And therefore we can't work anymore together. So this makes us, if not enemies, however, not friends anymore, which is also, evidently a pretty going, however, towards the direction of the conflict. And also, the observation by the subject who is preparing to betray that indeed, from the pact itself, he receives immediate and direct harm. Because not all agreements are actually for good, as you understand. So the betrayal can happen also at, you see, this policy now is being enforced. Everybody has accepted it. We did pass, think about whole the debate about the European Union. Because either you're a Europeist or an anti-Europeist, you're fundamentally wrong, right? If you care about this enormous opportunity that we have of the European Union, you can't be either of the two, right? You can't pretend that the European Union just does good or just does evil, right? And yet there are people who substantially lean in this regard, so that we should actually understand that there are pretty important differences in Europe, that there are many different interests. Consequently, there is an inherent conflict in it, right? Not just a competition, but properly, a problem of, how do we have to make it work after, a time which would never be working together, which is pretty complicated, as you realize. And Europe wasn't formed yesterday, or not even 300 years ago. So there are victims even here, but it's not necessarily going to be wrong for, but bad for the wall. And still, these victims are somewhat responsible sometimes for their own loss. But it's easy for, in this enormously complex reality, to carve enough material to build up either exclusively Europeist or exclusively anti-Europeist position. So an agreement, as a rule, has a temporal duration, right? It doesn't last forever, to be more concrete. So it is also implicit that the balance of its work, fundamental operation, is carried out on the due date, right? There is a specific object, there's always a strategic nature in it, of course. At that date, however, the condition of a subject could now be irrecoverable. That's the point. So you are saying now you were choking fundamentally someone to death by making him agree the same thing. You wanted, which could be enforced to threat, right? Sometimes you really don't have an option. This is also how great powers expand, right? It's not that great powers expand only through warfare, but it's obvious that sometimes the option for the other would be to exist militarily speaking. They wouldn't, like, look at how the Roman Empire expanded historically, right? So many Hellenistic powers granted to Rome, accepted Roman dominance. Why? It was essentially blackmail, right? It was the next door bully that knocked at every door, and with a threat of annihilation. And sometimes at some point it was better to be dominated, but without being exterminated in the process, right? So this is also how it happens. So it's a spontaneous tendency to unilaterally locate certain milestone to which a partial balance should be made, right? Certain, of course, conditions, certain specific regulations, right? But if you think about them, these milestones can become the premise of the decision to betray. That is to say, if you infringe this rule, the whole agreement jumps. And this obviously is why also we make agreements, because evidently we don't like the situation, but still maybe there is a peaceful way of satisfying the both of us by but it always implies some form of tolerance. It always implies some form of loss, right, from both sides. And that's also why the negotiation is a very serious thing. And the relation of strength at the same time. So there are certain specific examples further we can use to help clarifying and deepening the concept that we have just exposed. We'll talk about first of a false and then of a true betrayal, and seeing how it was handled. The first one is about Germany in World War I. So after the 1914-18 war, the search for a responsible for the defeat began in Germany, right? And here we will not explain how the German command since 1916 had realized the war was lost, and of course even the Schlieffen plan, which wasn't a good plan at all, right? And if it had been carried out correctly, it would have probably been even worse than the one it went. Was actually a single blow plan. It was designed just to win the war in those weeks. And when the Germans failed because they were stopped on the Marne, they could have simply asked France for a settlement, for a peace, and stopped the thing. Instead, no, they deliberately, so to get, of course, to accept defeat, but also, getting kind of better conditions than the ones for which eventually the whole of Europe suffered World War II on the inside, 30 years after. And instead, no, they went on fighting. Von Hindenburg's high command was fully responsible, and yet, at the time, as you know, who were accused, really? Lots of people. First of all, surprise, surprise, the Jews, right? Unfortunately, anti-Semitism has a very long root in European history, and it's useless to deny it, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but not only, in the West, they don't kid either. But at the time, as you know, the situation was pretty heated up in terms of black and red stuff, so workers' parties, also politicians overall, but even the German population as a whole, right? I don't know if you ever heard some Hitler's speech, but for example, it's something horrifying when he stated things like, and that was full World War II, he said, that they were fundamentally still the betrayers in within the German population. That is to say, they were asking the Germans to go to total war and to be annihilated in the process, but still, still pointed out that amongst them walked traitors, right? And not the Jews specifically. We're talking about Germans, right? That were, not just communists, not just the typical, but Germans in terms of the cowardly ones by National Socialist standards, that were also, of course, a good amount of sane people that didn't like National Socialism at all. So, as you know, the first post-war World War First period in Germany was a pretty dramatic moment, which people literally starved to death. Right, this happened already during the war. This is often forgotten, but we're talking about this. They were eating stuff with chemicals. There was a, it was let's forget, because it's an obscenely horrifying picture of what happened. Because fundamentally the same German government, of course, and the complete mishandling of the war. And of course it was this old idea, of course, of the backstabbers, right? Just like in the hero Siegfried had been stabbed in the back, the only vulnerable place, like a bit like Achilles, by the treacherous Hagen, right? And these backstabbers had naturally betrayed the soldiers at the front by stabbing them in the back. Guess whom was such a supporter of this idea? A guy that when in 1918 the armistice was signed, Germany surrendered, was in an hospital being gassed, and he wanted to come back to the front because he didn't understand how Germany could lose, since they were the greatest country in the world, and it was all fault of the backstabbers, not that the country had screwed up badly. Well, this guy was Adolf Hitler, of course. And the sad aspect of this story is that here there was something like that. As you know, the began, the fleet, the Northern Fleet was, properly mutinated. It was a situation that had become unsustainable, which was about the population. Of course, Germany was full of communists. This is true. They wanted a communist revolution. That's also what eventually the Weimar Republic put on order. But there was a bitter moment of strain. Think about the Freikorps. Think about also all the lands that Germany lost. Right, think about the recreation of Poland, all the border wars that were fought in these areas where Germans also had historically been settled since the Middle Ages, were obliged to abandon the country. So there were theoretically backstabbers everywhere, right? Especially if you consider that what the average idea that the Germans had in the beginning of the 20th century of the Slavs, among the other things. So it was everything. The broader picture is a communist Slavic Jew, or better, Slavic Jew is maybe it's not specifically connectable, but it was all a bit of the thing. And of course, that's how the stereotype began with to be intensified with the idea that after all the Jews had also Bolshevism had been there, but there would be a very important chapter to open about this. That is to say, how the so many German Jews that fought proudly, more than loyally, and absolutely devoted for Germany during World War I. Germany, German history in the first half of the 20th century is beautiful. It's one of the most horrible at some point, but also more controversial, but also more beautiful. Think about all the the expressionist cinema, all the various art, all the things that were born during the Weimar Republic was all wiped out by National Socialism. But there is properly also this aspect. It's not entirely positive. Think about, since we talk about medieval history, think about Kantorowicz, Kantorovitz, as you know, was one of the greatest medievalists of the 20th century. He wrote some astonishing, beautiful things. One of Frederick II, the King's Two Bodies. All these titles that are amazing, right? He's a life-changing author in a way if you study medieval history. Um, he was actually, and this is the dark side of the story. Eventually, the word controversial because Kantorovitz eventually fled Nazi Germany when immediately when they started persecuting the Jews. As a Jew, because he was a Jew, and he went to the United States, and then eventually, he wrote there his work. He was integrated. He realized actually the evil of National Socialism and of the whole thing, and he had actually a lot of moral problems because he had written this Frederick II that at the time, naturally, historiography was more primitive at the time than it is today. Um, in a sort of nationalistic sense. Of course, he saw as a German the the idea of the Reich in a positive, basically nationalistic sense, and he had fought proudly during World War the First. And when he was, and this is the dark side of the story, then when he was praised Germany-wide about this work that naturally was a masterpiece, historically speaking. But when the Nazi regime began to obstacle him, he wrote this letter to the government. I don't remember to who had censored his work, who had prevented him to teach. I don't remember exactly, but saying, but don't you know that I am, don't you remember that I am the one that wrote the beautiful work on Germany, how much I love the fatherland, how much I fought during World War the First, and so he was actually a nationalist. He was actually someone who, believed that after all Germany was fine with it. And Germany is fascinating in this sense because even, for example, the communists at the beginning, there are some figures that even Lenin himself praised in Germany as, some of the most orthodox Marxists at the time, who actually contemplated, in spite of the broader struggle of the permanent revolution worldwide, it actually, if Germany had been attacked, they would have defended Germany. Right, especially from Russia, because in the Marxian theory, as you probably know, Russia was considered as the most backward, most, in the country in which the revolution would have happened the latest, right? Instead, actually, that's where the communists rose to power, the earliest in Europe, because they thought, this is so bad. In the Marxian historical dialect, that there is this evolution that the bourgeoisie first has to develop, then eventually the industrial reality. Russia was very scarcely industrialized before World War the First, at least for Western standards and homogeneously in the country. Heterogeneous. I mean, you understand what I mean. And so, if Russia, the terrible Tsars, had the most oppressive, obscurantist regime in a Marxist perspective, would attack Germany, of course, a communist German would have had to fight, and these people went to the front as communists to fight for Germany against Tsarist Russia in World War I. So matters of perspective, that is to say to you how much the attachment to the nation was strong at the time. So that even this, reality, and this was perfectly coherent also in Marxian terms in a way, or at least, in some this very orthodox interpretations of the Marxian theory. So this is to explain what's the melange in that, and let's not forget that Jews were present among the many of the right-wing movements that would bring to the rise of fascism, movements that actually were also somewhat socialist. I mean, the most extremistic would gave origin to totalitarianism. This is very well known, actually. Look at fascism, look at there are many of this. That initially thought to be fully integrated in it because they were kind of, here it's complicated because naturally a part of the jury was better educated, so that's also true. The ideas of which these people had studied most, the newest theories, some were socialists, of course, so even godless in a sense, so you can, as far as Jews are concerned, so, think about the preeminence in the left at some levels that is stereotypical as well. But I mean, the idea that you can maybe be an atheist but being culturally Jew at the same time, and that was a wild time. So in which there was this tumultuous. Um, if you look at Chaplin's the Great Dictator, there's a pretty good depiction actually of the beginning where he's a he's probably a Jewish German that fights in World War I very proudly, and he finds himself eventually into what is a parody of National Socialist Germany. So it's very complex, and it's not easy to tell as a story. But this is just for saying how against evidence, right, against goodness, against reason, these discriminations were carried out. These were people that had fought and bled alongside any other German as they were German, strongly believe in themselves. And the legend still lasts today, because I presume, I don't know because I never talked to one specifically, but if you talk to a National Socialist, I presume, to a neo-Nazi, that they will still tell you that, of course, in World War I, Germany was betrayed by the Jews. Blah, 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 blah. And you understand at that point why these people are so stupid, among the other things. Because objectively, they don't even know the history of their own country. Isn't it ironic? Like, you care so much about your nation, the fatherland, and you don't even know, kind of the ABC of your own history. Well, this is what extremism is. So there is a kind of a ransoming of the German picture in here, because of course the Germans, the German military proper, were the first one to debunk this idiocy that the Jews were the cause of, that were the backstabbers, right? Because the German military was the one that first conducted this thorough investigation into the causes of the defeat in World War I, which, do you know how it ended? It ended with a condemnation of the stubborn mistakes made, of course, by von Hindenburg's high command. As it, of course, it was the case, right, since the beginning of the war, with extreme sacrifices of the German people, and naturally of all of its components. It's an ugly history, very ugly history. So in this dramatic context, you understand that betrayal was not just a slanderous accusation, which is also insulting. Just imagine you're a Jewish veteran, and you have fought and you've seen your country, you've saved your countries, like you've been through that hell that the trench warfare was unspeakably about, and when you come home, you're told that you're a betrayer. Right, it's not that it's strong. It's a different context. But think about all what veterans in general are exposed to in terms of ideological misconceptions, and how this has been a problem in a society. It was quite prudent at some levels, but naturally very hypocritical, where there were deep social divides. All these various naturally political differences were highlighting the inherent contradictions of this reality in a world that was changing, because World War I changed the history of the world forever, right? But the worst is of course the identification of the person, right, responsible for a real Goethe-Dammerung, right, this enormous epochal catastrophe, which was claimed could have originated only from a blow to the shoulders, a backstabbing, the only weak point of an invincible arm. So here you have both the insult. You have an insult to the same thing, right? Because that invincible army, right, wasn't of course invincible, because not only because Germany lost the war, but also because no army is invincible by definition, but it was misused too. And It was misused with the sacrifice of all these young men, including the same Jews that you were accusing of destroying that same army. You see what the point is, which is utterly disgusting, to say the least. So, in this case, betrayal becomes the only possible explanation for an impossible event. This was the point. All that ultra-nationalism that was, shouted in William's II era, the great Reich, or the great nation, the fatherland, and all this stuff. We are the best of everybody. Turns out they weren't. They lost the war, right? And they lost it also pretty badly. This is something we often forget. It's not just, of course, it's also about how you fight it, but especially in that, it was fought pretty damn bad. And also, World War II was essentially in the same way. So just think about restoring honor to these causes, to the causes that brought all these people to die in all of our countries. For a mistake. It was also stupidly ideologically driven. There was also a mishandling, miscomprehension of von Clausewitz and its precepts. It was a grotesque caricature of a misunderstanding of the Clausewitzian text, for which also stupid people blame von Clausewitz. That has, of course, anything to do with the disasters of the 20th century. But that was the point. It was probably the incapability of accepting that, of course, the German defeat was possible, as any country's defeat is possible. And this tells you naturally a lot what the general feelings of the masses was about, right? These were not people that eventually redeemed themselves, because 30 years afterwards, the Germans were democratically electing the National Socialist Party. So, until an objective and serious examination that reconstructs the genesis and the dynamics of a military outcome, this is just chit-chat, right? It's simply, you are hysterical about your own, you're not assuming your own responsibilities. Right? And this is one of the worst aspects, naturally, also of politics in its regard. We are all responsible for all what happens to our political community, because we all have a place in this. So it doesn't work at all that it's one guy's fault. It's the fault, at least, of all those who supported him and those who have nothing to do to stop it. And this is, of course, valid for World War II too. And it doesn't happen that the guy enforces it to you, right? Because it's if the orders to put a rifle in your hand to go out kill people, you say, well, it's either those people or me. Yes, but you're still killing them. You're not using that gun to point at that guy, right? You're using it, and that's to obey him, and that's exactly what it is. Because not even the strongest of totalitarianisms has the control on the masses. If the masses disagree with totalitarianism, as history teaches us, totalitarianism falls. The problem with totalitarianisms is that people support totalitarianism. The majority of them, the majority of the moral forces of the country supports it. Otherwise it cannot work, as for any other government. This is also a Clausewitzian concept, by the way. The second example is relatively less controversial, at least as far as the Europe is concerned, because I talk briefly about General Benedict Arnold, right? So Arnold is a bit the archetype of the traitor in American popular culture. At least in Europe, I don't know, in my country it's very little known. And Arnold was an excellent general in the American Revolutionary War. He certainly deserves much credit for the successes obtained in the initial phase of the war by the revolting colonies. He won at the Battle of Saratoga, right? From which he got also 5 centimeters of leg away from an injury, but also, and above all, he lost much in the spirit at the same time. Because not only he was not recognized for a passage of a rank as a promotion, but the Congress did not even reimburse the expenses incurred during the campaign, throwing him in ruin. Plot that he had devised to make his passage to the other field failed. And the plot actually was very well studied because it would have involved the cession of the fort of West Point to the British and the division in two halves of the rebel colonies. An event that, if it had happened, right, it would have basically brought to the end of the independentist cause, right? And what is important here is that even the memory of his success at Saratoga has been erased. Right, on the monument that celebrates him on the battlefield, it says, the best general of the Continental Army, but his name does not appear. Right, so that his praise remains anonymous, hanging in the air. So the point here is that we can acknowledge the traitor Arnold more than a few good reasons for feeling betrayed in turn. Here the whole picture is very complex because that there were many Americans that cooperated with the British and that thought that objectively the future of their own country as true Americans would have been to remain. The situation in the current state, or at least not to recur to the mean of rebellion. So who knows how many times actually the rebels were called such as betrayers, by the same fellow Americans in this regard. But of course history went in a different way, and this is exactly the point we are making, that his reputation, especially in the United States, is one, but we would have a very different opinion today if his plan, a radical one, completely radically different one, if his plan had been successful instead. This is a very serious point, right? Who was he? Right? Who was a betrayer or a hero? Because both terms are actually, as we've seen, probably overrated, because heroically speaking, I don't like very much the term hero, albeit sometimes I recognize it, but it must be pretty strict. And especially because I talk a lot about military history, everybody needs to find that they are heroes in a way, but but that's not the point of the thing too. We're not trying to find betrayers or heroes here. We're trying to be more more objective about our historical inquiry, right? And there is a point though that, to answer the last question, we can quote Cervantes from, who wrote, "Betrayal is welcome, but traitors are hateful." So that Cervantes, together with Shakespeare and Ariosto, are basically the pillars of modern Western literature. This phrase should make us reflect. Betrayal is welcome, but traitors are hateful. So this is a very subtle realization of an author that was looking from a Renaissance perspective at that point to the surpassing of the moral formalism, in a way, into something else, right? In the idea that, after all, betrayal is convenient. Of course it is, as we've seen everybody does it in practice, right? But those who betray specifically are more easily to scapegoat. So that it's extremely easy to accuse someone of something. Just look at the contemporary political discourse. What are we doing here, right? We are morally blaming everybody for just a comma and not really thinking about ourselves, not even for a second. Not just whether that's good or not to accuse the person, because actually I disagree when people say it's bad to be judgmental. Why not, right? We have the faculty to judge, but the point is, just as for many other things, we should do it in an intelligent way, right? You can't be whatever you want, but fundamentally you're not good at it. You don't see a point. You're not a rational person. You're not educated about what you're talking. You're not informed. Um, why, why do why do you do it? And that's exactly the point. That it's very easy to get rid of someone of this false accusations, or accusations that maybe even be true, but that have a different motivation. As we've seen in these two examples, the last two examples we've made. So my hope is naturally that we can all see a bit more honestly within ourselves, and realize what certain ideas that we have about ourselves, about others, about the past, about our history, that we can see through a different lens, that is not a matter of private, personal ego, that gets offended because they realize that superheroes do not exist, that most of what we've been told by the world in general is fundamentally a story. I don't want to say a fairy tale, but a story, and it doesn't entail the fundamental process of history, which is a completely different thing, right? And most of the history that we learn is just a story disguised for history, and that most of this process has to come from within yourself, right? It has to come from your own active, autonomous, critical thinking that cannot be cultivated in a few years, right? It has to proceed from a very long commitment that at that point will make you understand properly what is that history is worth, politically, civilly, and morally speaking. Because otherwise, things will not get better, right? We will be always accusing the wrong people or making the wrong judgments, and not helping ourselves first and foremost, as far as our own interests and the possibility of creating a common and prosperous future together are concerned. And it's not always possible, unfortunately. And that's where it begins. It begins to say, okay, it was him, or it was you. That's already a moment in which you would start, as a mature person, to say, okay, well, maybe we can all reconsider the thing together, coldly, rationally, and to come to an agreement, which is not a definitive settlement, as nothing is, and politics and societies always change. But it's just at least a better way to handle the world. It's just reacting emotionally, hysterically, impulsively, as we all do, right? And we need more discipline. We all do. And with this, I actually leave you here, because today we talked about pretty heavy stuff that I was honestly happy to throw out, like to say, we rarely talk about 20th century history, so I don't understand. I have my opinions that, once again, are hopefully built on actual evidence, not on personal mood. But they are heavy stuff, because in this world they will react, right, brutally with people that cannot accept even certain thoughts, right? Starting from the disgusting anti-Semitism that is dramatically widespread in all Western world in different ways, but it's utterly embarrassing for the achievements of the West to have fallen to such level of barbarism with certain thoughts. I presume anti-Semitism is the most evident indicator of the uncivility of a people, right? But there are others, right, and they're all intertwined, unfortunately. All right, well, we'll leave it here. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.